The story does not begin in deep time. It begins with confusion. In the freezing waters of the North Pacific, sailors described a creature so large and so calm that it barely reacted to human presence. It floated near the surface like a drifting island of flesh, dark, wrinkled, and strangely motionless except for the slow sweep of its tail. Some thought it was a whale, others thought it was a giant seal. A few believed it was simply a sea monster made gentle by cold water. But none of those explanations fit. The animal did not dive like whales. It did not bark like seals. It did not hunt, chase, or flee. Instead, it grazed, quietly, constantly, methodically tearing long strands of seaweed from the ocean floor and chewing them with slow, patient movements. It was a marine mammal, but not one evolution had prepared for the future. Today we call it Steller's sea cow. And unlike whales, dolphins, or seals, this animal represents one of the clearest examples of evolution, producing a creature perfectly designed for a world that would soon disappear. A species so specialized that survival itself became impossible. But to understand why its evolution failed, we first need to understand the mistake scientists made when they first saw it. Because at first glance, it looks successful. It was massive, up to 9 meters long, heavier than an elephant, larger than most modern whales that share its coastal habitat. Its skin was thick and bark-like, almost resembling tree wood more than flesh. Blubber insulated it against subarctic temperatures. Its lungs allowed it to float effortlessly at the surface. Its metabolism supported a constant feeding cycle. Everything about the animal suggested stability. And stability in evolution usually means success. Yet within less than 30 years of being discovered by humans, the entire species vanished forever. No long decline, no ice age collapse, no million-year struggle, just sudden absence. This raises the central mystery of our story. How can an animal survive for millions of years and then fail instantly? The answer is hidden inside its body design. Because Steller's sea cow did not merely adapt to the ocean, it committed to one single version of the ocean. And evolution rarely forgives that kind of commitment. To understand why, we need to step back to a much older story, the return of mammals to the sea. Hundreds of millions of years ago, life crawled onto land. Limbs replaced fins, lungs replaced gills, gravity replaced buoyancy. For ages, survival meant staying on land. But evolution does not move in one direction. It moves toward opportunity. When food became abundant in shallow coastal waters, certain mammals began moving back into the ocean, not suddenly, but gradually. First swimming, then hunting, then living there permanently. Different groups solved the same problem in different ways. Whales reshaped their entire skeletons. Their hind limbs disappeared. Their nostrils moved to the top of the head. Their spines transformed into propulsion engines. Seals kept their limbs, but modified them into flippers, allowing movement on both land and ice. Manatees and dugongs took a third path, herbivores grazing underwater vegetation. And Steller's sea cow belonged to that last group, but it went further than any of them. Modern manatees can swim rivers, estuaries, and coastlines. Dugongs migrate across tropical seas. Both can maneuver, dive, and relocate when environments change. Stella's sea cow could not. Its body tells the story. The tail was wide but not built for speed. The flippers were small and weak. The head pointed downward permanently, adapted only for grazing. Its teeth were replaced by grinding plates specialized for kelp. Even its behavior showed it had no predators for millions of years. It did not fear surface activity. It did not flee disturbances. It gathered in family groups near shorelines in water shallow enough for humans to stand in. It behaved less like a wild animal and more like a grazing livestock animal placed in the ocean. And that detail is important. Predators shape intelligence. Competition shapes mobility. Environmental variability shapes flexibility. Stella's sea cow experienced none of those pressures. Its world was stable, cold, nutrient-rich, and predictable for geological ages. Giant kelp forests stretched endlessly along the North Pacific Rim. Storms churned nutrients upward. Ice cycles stabilized ecosystems, and the animal's slow metabolism matched perfectly with slow-growing plants. For millions of years, evolution had no reason to change it, so it didn't. And that lack of change became its greatest weakness. Because evolution does not design species for survival, it designs them for past conditions. The sea cow was not primitive. It was not poorly adapted. It was, in fact, extraordinarily optimized. Too optimized. Imagine a machine engineered to operate perfectly at exactly one temperature, one pressure, one fuel source, and one terrain. Under those conditions, it performs flawlessly. Outside them, it stops instantly. That was this animal. It did not just live in cold water, it required a very specific coastal kelp ecosystem. It did not just eat plants, it depended almost entirely on giant kelp canopies. It did not just move slowly, its anatomy prevented rapid relocation. In other words, its evolutionary strategy assumed its environment would never change quickly. For millions of years, that assumption was correct. Then humans arrived. But before humans even touched the animal, the first cracks in its survival system had already begun. At the end of the last ice age, coastlines shifted, sea levels rose, kelp forests redistributed, populations fragmented into isolated pockets. The species that once occupied a vast Pacific range became restricted to a small remote area near the Commander Islands. It was already surviving on borrowed time, a specialist species in a shrinking habitat. Yet it still endured quiet, slow grazing endlessly. When naturalists first encountered it in the 18th century, they were not observing a thriving species. They were observing the last survivors of an evolutionary gamble that had worked for epochs but could not tolerate sudden change. And that is where our story truly begins. Because the sea cow did not go extinct simply because humans hunted it. Many species are hunted and survive. It went extinct because evolution had removed its ability to respond. In the next part, we will explore exactly how mammals returned to the sea and why this particular lineage took adaptation further than any other marine mammal, crossing the invisible boundary between specialization and fragility. To understand why the sea cow could not survive change, we need to understand the kind of world that shaped it, not just the ocean, a very specific ocean. The North Pacific during the late Ice Age was not the chaotic, shifting marine environment we imagine today. Along its cold coastlines stretched enormous kelp forests, not patches, not fields, but continent-length ecosystems. Dense vertical forests rising from the seafloor to the surface, forming floating canopies thick enough to calm waves and create sheltered corridors. Inside those forests, the water barely moved. Predators struggled to maneuver, currents slowed, temperatures stabilized. Food grew continuously. For a herbivore, this was the most reliable buffet Earth had ever produced. Kelp grows fast, faster than land plants of similar size. Storms tear it loose, sunlight regrows it, nutrients upwell, and the cycle repeats. A grazing animal did not need to migrate, hunt, or compete intensely. It simply stayed, and staying is the most dangerous luxury evolution can provide, because movement drives adaptability. Most marine mammals evolved in dynamic conditions. Dolphins chased fish schools, whales followed seasonal blooms, seals alternated between land and sea. Even modern manatees must relocate when water temperature drops. But Stella's sea cow existed inside an ecosystem where relocation was unnecessary for immense spans of time. So evolution removed the ability. Its skeleton reveals this clearly. The vertebrae are heavy and dense, acting like ballast. That made floating easy but fast, swimming inefficient. The ribs were thick and reinforced, stabilizing the body rather than allowing twisting motion. The flippers lacked joint flexibility for precise maneuvering. Its tail generated propulsion, but only slowly designed for steady cruising, not escape. Energy efficiency replaced agility. Every trait points toward the same strategy: minimize effort, maximize feeding time. Even breathing reflects it. The sea cow floated near the surface almost constantly. Instead of deep-diving cycles like whales, it maintained a shallow, relaxed pattern. Oxygen conservation was unnecessary because food was always within reach. An animal built for urgency evolves reflexes. An animal built for stability loses them. Over thousands of generations, predators around the species declined. Large sharks and marine reptiles that once occupied colder seas vanished. Killer whales existed, but kelp density protected large herbivores from sustained pursuit. The sea cow became effectively unchallenged, and when an animal stops being hunted, its brain changes. Not smaller in size, but different in function. Fear responses weaken, reaction times slow. Curiosity replaces caution. Historical accounts describe the sea cows approaching boats rather than avoiding them. They nudged floating debris. They remained nearby even after others were harpooned. Some stayed beside injured individuals instead of fleeing. From a human perspective, that behavior seems gentle. From an evolutionary perspective, it is catastrophic. Because fear is not merely emotion, it is survival programming written by predators over millions of years. Remove the predators, and the program erases itself. But the sea cow did not only lose fear, it lost the need for flexibility. Look at its feeding anatomy. Instead of multiple tooth types, it developed broad keratinous grinding plates, continuously worn down by kelp abrasion. This worked perfectly for fibrous algae, but almost nothing else. Unlike omnivorous marine mammals, it could not switch diet if vegetation changed. Unlike grazers on land, it could not move inland. Unlike whales, it could not hunt. It was locked into one energy source, and that energy source depended on environmental stability. As long as kelp forests persisted at large scale, the species thrived. Fossil evidence suggests its ancestors once ranged across the entire North Pacific Rim from Japan to California. For millions of years, that distribution held. Then, climate changed rapidly. When the last glacial maximum ended roughly 12,000 years ago, ice sheets retreated. Sea levels rose dramatically. Coastlines reshaped within a geological instant. Shallow platforms submerged too deeply for kelp attachment in some regions and became exposed rock in others. Kelp forests fragmented. This did not immediately kill the sea cow. Instead, populations slowly isolated into smaller pockets. Gene flow decreased. Migration routes vanished because the animals lacked long-distance travel capability. Local conditions determined survival. And isolation introduces a silent danger: lack of redundancy. Wide-ranging species can recover from regional disasters. Local populations may vanish, but others repopulate. A highly localized species cannot. Each remaining habitat becomes essential. By the time humans eventually encountered the animal, its global range had already collapsed to a narrow region around the Commander Islands in the Bering Sea. A single ecosystem supporting an entire species. From the outside, it still looked abundant. Early explorers described herds resting along shorelines, feeding in groups, floating peacefully in cold water. But abundance inside one location is not security. It is concentration of risk. Evolution had created a creature perfectly tuned to a stable kelp coastline, and then geological time removed almost all such coastlines. Yet still, the species survived. Why? Because its metabolic strategy was extremely conservative. Sea cows did not reproduce quickly, but they did not need to. Adults had few natural deaths. Lifespans were long. Energy consumption was low relative to body mass. As long as food existed and disturbances remained rare, population decline was slow. It was not a thriving empire anymore. It was a lingering remnant. Think of it less as a powerful species and more as a candle that had burned steadily for ages and was now shortened but still lit. Nothing in its evolutionary history prepared it for rapid disturbance. Not storms, not predators, not habitat collapse occurring within years instead of millennia. And that brings us to the crucial concept. Evolution measures time differently than history. Natural selection works across thousands of generations. Human expansion changes ecosystems within decades. A species adapted to geological time cannot react to historical time. The sea cow existed in geological time. Humans operate in historical time. The moment those two timescales intersect, the outcome becomes predictable. But the failure had already begun before the first harpoon struck, because specialization does not only restrict diet and movement, it restricts decision-making. Animals with variable environments develop exploratory behavior. They test new food, new routes, new shelters. The sea cow's environment never demanded experimentation, so behavior became routine. Graze, float, rest, repeat. Routine is efficient in stability. Routine is fatal in disruption. When conditions shift suddenly, generalists hesitate briefly, then adapt. Specialists continue the same behavior until the behavior stops working. The sea cow continued. It approached unfamiliar objects. It remained in shallow water. It clustered in predictable feeding grounds. It followed injured companions instead of dispersing. Every one of those traits had been safe for millions of years. None of them would remain safe once humans appeared in its habitat. In the next part, we will reach that moment, the first encounter between a species designed for a permanent world and a species that transforms worlds wherever it arrives. The year was 1741. A Russian expedition led by Vitus Bering crossed the North Pacific, searching for new trade routes and territory. The voyage did not go well. Storms scattered the ships. Scurvy weakened the crew. Supplies ran out. Eventually, one of the vessels wrecked near a remote group of islands in the Bering Sea, later called the Commander Island. The survivors were not explorers anymore. They were stranded men trying not to die. Among them was a German naturalist and physician, Georg Wilhelm Steller. Unlike most of the crew, he was trained to observe rather than merely survive. And while the sailors focused on food, shelter, and fire, Steller noticed something else, moving slowly along the shoreline waters. At first glance, it looked like a floating mass of dark rock drifting beside the kelp beds. Then it breathed. What he observed would become one of the most extraordinary biological descriptions ever recorded, not because the animal was rare, but because it was already at the edge of extinction the moment humans discovered it. The creature showed no fear. It remained near the shore, chewing kelp continuously, its massive back breaking the surface. Its skin was not smooth like whales or seals. Instead, it resembled cracked tree bark, thick, rough, and layered, almost armored. The head was small relative to the body, with whiskered lips constantly pulling algae into its mouth. No teeth were visible, only grinding plates inside the jaw-processed vegetation. Steller approached by boat. The animal did not dive. He moved closer. It did not flee. He touched it with an oar. The sea cow simply shifted slightly and continued feeding. For a marine mammal, this behavior was unprecedented. Even species unfamiliar with humans instinctively react to large disturbances in the water. Sudden pressure waves, shadows, or noise trigger escape reflexes. The sea cow possessed none. Steller noted entire groups feeding together, mothers with calves, adults supporting injured individuals near the surface. When one was harpooned later, others remained nearby instead of dispersing. Some even attempted to keep the wounded animal afloat. This was not stupidity. It was evolutionary history. For countless generations, no fast aquatic predator had hunted them in shallow kelp forests. Cooperation was safer than panic. Stability rewarded calmness. Flight responses faded. The stranded sailors, however, were starving. Within days, they realized the animals were edible, and not only edible, but ideal survival food. The flesh tasted like beef. The fat burned cleanly for fire. The skin could be turned into boat covering. A single individual could feed many men for weeks. The sea cows still did not flee. Hunting them required no strategy. Boats approached slowly in shallow water. Harpoons struck repeatedly because the animals were so large that immediate death was rare. The wounded struggled weakly, but speed was impossible. Others stayed nearby, sometimes circling the injured one. It could take hours to kill a single animal. During that time, the rest of the herd remained within reach. From a survival perspective, this was a perfect resource. From an evolutionary perspective, it was the end. The crew did not understand they were encountering the final population of a once widespread species. To them, the animals appeared plentiful. Herds rested along the coastline, feeding grounds were predictable, the ecosystem seemed inexhaustible. This illusion is common in extinction events. When a species is highly concentrated geographically, local abundance masks global rarity. Humans perceive density, not distribution. After rescue and return to civilization, news spread rapidly among fur traders and hunters. Not scientific curiosity, economic opportunity. The Commander Islands became a stopover location for ships traveling between Asia and North America. Crews hunted sea cows regularly for fresh meat and supplies. The species had two fatal traits. It lived only in that region, and it could not avoid humans. Population decline was immediate. Unlike animals hunted across large ranges, there were no remote refuges, no inaccessible breeding grounds, no seasonal migrations to escape pressure. Every individual lived in reachable coastal waters. Every group followed habitual feeding paths. Every calf learned the same behavior. Within a few decades, sightings became less frequent. Within 27 years of Stella's first description, the last confirmed sea cow was killed. No gradual adaptation occurred. No shift in behavior was recorded. No dispersal to new areas. The species continued living exactly as it always had until the final individuals disappeared. That is what makes this extinction unique. Many species vanish because environments deteriorate slowly or catastrophes overwhelm them. The sea cow vanished because its evolutionary success removed the need to react quickly, and reaction is the only defense against sudden change. The animal was not fragile in body, it was fragile in possibility. Evolution had narrowed its lifestyle to a single path so effective in the past that alternatives never developed. When that path closed, there were no others. Whales survived commercial hunting because they migrate across oceans. Seals survive because they breed in remote colonies. Manatees survive because they inhabit multiple warm water systems. But the sea cow existed only where it had always existed and nowhere else. In a sense, it did not recognize a new world had begun. To the final individuals, the shoreline still contained kelp. The water still held their family groups. The same routine continued day after day. The threat was not ecological collapse or starvation. It was interaction with a new predator operating on a timescale evolution could not match. The extinction, therefore, was not only human-caused, it was evolutionary exposure. A species shaped by stability encountered a species defined by change. The sea cow represents the boundary condition of adaptation, the point where being perfectly suited to an environment becomes identical to being unable to survive outside it. And this brings us to the deeper question the rest of the documentary will explore. Did evolution fail the sea cow, or did success itself create the failure? In the next chapter, we step backward millions of years to examine how mammals returned to the ocean in the first place and why every other marine mammal lineage retained flexibility that this one lost. To understand why the sea cow became trapped by its own success, We need to rewind far beyond the 18th century, far beyond the Ice Age, to a time when mammals did not belong in the ocean at all. For most of Earth's history, the sea was not a place mammals could live permanently. Mammals are warm-blooded, air-breathing, limb-supported animals designed for gravity. Water removes gravity's support, increases heat loss, limits oxygen intake, and demands a completely different method of movement. A land mammal entering the ocean faces multiple immediate problems. It cannot breathe continuously, its fur traps water instead of insulating air, its limbs push against resistance rather than ground, and its senses operate poorly in a refractive medium. Yet evolution does not respect boundaries. It follows food. After the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago, marine ecosystems changed dramatically. Large marine reptiles disappeared, and coastal waters filled with unexploited ecological niches. Fish populations expanded. Marine plants spread in shallow seas. Predator roles opened. And on land, certain mammals lived near rivers and coasts, feeding on whatever washed ashore. At first, the interaction was simple, wading, not swimming. Many mammals today still show this early stage. Deer cross rivers, bears catch fish, pigs forage in wetlands. These behaviors do not require redesign, only tolerance. But over thousands of generations, individuals that could stay in water slightly longer gained access to new food. Those that tolerated colder temperatures survived better in coastal climates. Small advantages accumulated. Gradually, some mammals stopped merely visiting the sea. They began depending on it. But different groups solve the same problem differently. And those differences explain why most marine mammals survived human expansion while the sea cow did not. The first lineage to fully commit-produced whales, their ancestors resembled wolf-like land predators. Fossils show transitional forms walking on hooves but swimming with flexible spines. Over millions of years, their hind legs shrank, forelimbs flattened into flippers, and the spine evolved into a propulsion system. The nostrils migrated to the top of the head, forming a blowhole, a breathing adaptation, allowing them to inhale without lifting the entire body. Most importantly, whales retained mobility. They did not attach to one location. Instead, they followed moving resources. Fish, schools, plankton blooms, seasonal migrations of prey. Even the largest whales travel thousands of kilometers annually. Their survival strategy is movement across space. Movement prevents total dependency on one habitat. The second lineage produced seals and sea lions. These animals kept their connection to land. They feed at sea but rest and reproduce on shorelines or ice. If food disappears locally, they relocate. If predators increase, they change breeding grounds. Their dual environment lifestyle preserved flexibility. The third lineage, the one relevant to our story, produced sirenians, manatees, dugongs, and eventually the sea cow. Unlike whales, they became herbivores. Unlike seals, they abandoned land almost completely. They chose an ecological niche rarely occupied by large animals, underwater grazing. At first, this niche was safe and abundant. Shallow coastal waters across the world supported seagrass meadows and kelp forests. Herbivory requires less energy than predation, allowing slow metabolism and large body size. Size protects against predators. Warm blood allows cold water feeding, everything aligned towards stability. Early Sirenians spread widely. Fossil records place their relatives along warm tropical seas and colder northern coasts. They were not fragile animals, they were successful specialists occupying calm marine plant ecosystems. But within this lineage, one branch began evolving toward colder waters and kelp-dominated habitats. This branch would eventually become Stella's sea cow, and its path diverged from other marine mammals in one critical way. Instead of balancing adaptation with flexibility, it intensified adaptation while removing flexibility. To see why this matters, consider the pressures shaping marine bodies. Water favors streamlining. Predators require speed. Prey requires maneuverability. Temperature demands insulation. Oxygen demands surfacing patterns. Whales solved this by becoming powerful swimmers. Seals solved it by dividing life between land and water. Manatees solved it by remaining slow but mobile in wide, warm habitats. The sea cow solved it by eliminating unnecessary abilities entirely. It did not need fast-turning kelp, does not run. It did not need deep-diving kelp, grows near surface light. It did not need migration. Kelp forests persisted year-round in its ancient environment. Every trait removed saved energy. Every removed ability increased efficiency. And evolution rewards efficiency as long as conditions remain stable. Over hundreds of thousands of generations, the animal's design converged on a single lifestyle: float near coastlines and graze continuously. Even buoyancy control changed. Dense bones countered blubber flotation so it could hover at feeding depth without constant swimming. The mouth pointed downward permanently. Lips became gripping tools rather than sensory structures. The brain followed the body. Marine mammals with active hunting lifestyles show high neural processing for echolocation, pursuit, and coordination. Grazing specialists require less environmental calculation. Behavior becomes routine-driven instead of reactive. Energy saved in cognition supports survival in nutrient-limited systems. For millions of years, this was a winning strategy. The sea cow's ancestors spread along the Pacific Rim. They were not rare curiosities. They were ecological engineers, trimming kelp forests, recycling nutrients, and stabilizing plant growth cycles, much like large herbivores on land-shaped grasslands. Then, climate variability increased. Ice cycles intensified during the Pleistocene. Coastlines repeatedly advanced and retreated. In warm periods, habitats expanded. In cold peaks, they contracted. Mobile species tracked these changes. The sea cow lineage could not track them quickly. Not because it was weak, because it was optimized. By the time the most recent ice age ended, its range had shrunk dramatically. Other Sirenians remained in tropical waters, where temperature fluctuations were moderate. But the northern specialist remained tied to cold kelp ecosystems that no longer stretched continuously across oceans. It survived in fragments. And fragmentation is the beginning of evolutionary risk. A species becomes safe not only by adaptation, but by redundancy, multiple populations across multiple habitats. When redundancy disappears, every disturbance becomes potentially final. Yet evolution does not anticipate the future. The sea cow had become perfectly adapted to a world that existed for millions of years. Nothing in its evolutionary history selected for rapid dispersal, fear of surface disturbances, or behavioral flexibility under new predation patterns. Those traits would only matter once humans entered the ecosystem. In the next part, we will examine exactly how extreme this specialization became and why the sea cow's body itself prevented it from ever escaping a collapsing environment. Evolution rarely creates useless features. If a structure disappears over time, it is usually because maintaining it costs energy without providing survival advantage. Over generations, natural selection trims accessibility the way an engineer removes unnecessary components from a machine. In most animals, this process stops before flexibility is lost. In the sea cow, it did not. Its anatomy represents one of the most extreme cases of biological simplification among large mammals, not primitive, but narrowed. Every trait points toward one singular activity: slow, continuous grazing in shallow, cold water. To see how far this went, we need to compare it with its closest living relatives. Modern manatees still retain noticeable neck movement. They can angle their heads upward or sideways to grasp floating plants. Dugongs can pivot along seafloor meadows and maneuver around obstacles. Both species possess relatively mobile flippers, allowing steering, turning, and minor object manipulation. The sea cow lost most of this. Its neck vertebrae were shortened and stiffened. The head naturally pointed downward, aligning the mouth permanently toward the kelp canopy below. This reduced muscular effort while feeding it no longer needed to reposition constantly, but it also limited awareness of surroundings above or behind. Its flippers were proportionally small compared to body mass. They functioned less as steering organs and more as stabilizers, preventing rolling while floating. Fine maneuvering was almost impossible. Turning required moving the entire body through slow tail motion. Speed was never part of its design. Even the tail itself reveals compromise. Whales possess horizontal flukes capable of powerful vertical strokes, enabling bursts of acceleration. The sea cow's tail was broad, but less muscularly efficient for rapid propulsion. It produced steady forward movement suitable for cruising between feeding patches, not escape from threat. But the most revealing adaptation lies inside the skeleton. Unlike most marine mammals, the sea cow had extremely dense bones, a condition called pachyosteosclerosis. Instead of lightweight bones aiding swimming efficiency, its skeleton acted as ballast. Blubber naturally increases buoyancy. Dense bone counterbalanced it, allowing the animal to hover near the kelp without constant effort. This is elegant energy engineering. However, it locks the animal into shallow water. Deep diving requires buoyancy, control, and lung compression tolerance. The sea cow's structure favored stable depth, not vertical travel. If disturbed, it could not rapidly dive away like whales or seals. Its escape path existed only horizontally and slowly. Diet reinforced this confinement. Kelp is fibrous, abrasive, and low in digestible energy compared to animal prey. To survive on it, the sea cow evolved continuous feeding behavior. Historical observers reported them eating almost constantly, processing large volumes to extract sufficient nutrition. Their teeth disappeared over evolutionary time, replaced by keratinous plates that wore down and regrew. This grinding system works efficiently only on tough marine plants. Switching to alternative food, fish, softer vegetation, or carrion would not be merely unfamiliar. It would be mechanically difficult. So mobility decreased, diving decreased, dietary flexibility vanished, and reaction speed diminished. Each change individually improved efficiency within a stable kelp ecosystem. Together they removed every backup survival strategy. To understand why this matters, consider how most animals handle environmental change. If predators increase, prey species become faster or more alert. If food shifts, omnivores alter diet composition. If habitat shrinks, migratory species relocate. These are not conscious decisions but inherited capabilities, preserved because environments fluctuate. The sea cow evolved in an environment where fluctuation was minimal for immense periods. Selection, therefore, favored energy conservation over versatility. Over millions of years, traits supporting alternative behaviors were not maintained. It did not merely specialize in kelp, it specialized in one behavioral loop: float, graze, breathe, rest, repeat. Even reproduction reflects this slow stability. Gestation periods were long, likely over a year. Calves developed gradually under maternal protection. Such strategies work when adult mortality is low. They fail when mortality suddenly rises because population replacement cannot accelerate. In evolutionary terms, the sea cow was a K-selected organism pushed to an extreme, investing in survival of few offspring rather than rapid reproduction. For epochs without significant predation, this maximizes efficiency. But when a new predator appears, population decline becomes irreversible. Another overlooked consequence of extreme specialization involves perception. Animals living in dynamic environments process large volumes of sensory data. Movement, sound variation, and chemical signals demand rapid interpretation. But in predictable habitats, consistent patterns reduce the need for constant vigilance. Reports from Stella and subsequent hunters indicate the sea cow relied primarily on touch and low-frequency sound, not rapid visual threat detection. They often failed to respond to approaching boats until physical contact occurred. Even repeated disturbance did not produce learned avoidance. Learning requires variation in outcomes. If approaching objects have never caused harm for millions of years, no behavioral framework exists to interpret them as danger. The species had not evolved stupidity, it had evolved certainty. And certainty is stable only while conditions remain unchanged. By the 18th century, the environment had already shifted significantly from the one that shaped its ancestors. Its range was restricted to a single island chain. Food remained available, but ecological redundancy had vanished. The species continued operating under ancient rules in a world where change was accelerating. Then a new predator entered, one that hunted not by speed or stealth alone, but by persistence and technology. Unlike natural predators, humans did not depend on the animal's behavior to succeed. Even a slow pursuit ended with a kill, because tools compensated for biological limitations. The sea cow had no evolutionary pathway to counter tools. In the next part, we will look at the final stage of adaptation, how the animal's behavior, social structure, and metabolism completed the transformation from resilient species to ecological dead end. Body structure explains why the sea cow could not escape quickly. Behavior explains why it never tried. In evolution, anatomy limits what an animal can do. Behavior determines what it will do. Many species possess physical abilities. They rarely use emergency responses, triggered only when conditions demand them. But when an environment remains stable for long enough, even those emergency behaviors fade. The sea cow lived in one of the most stable behavioral environments any large mammal had ever known. For millions of years, nothing in its world required panic. No sudden ambush predators in dense kelp forests. No seasonal starvation forcing migration. No violent territorial competition between large herbivores. No need to protect distant breeding grounds. Life followed a repeating pattern: feeding, surfacing, resting in groups, then feeding again. And slowly, over evolutionary time, its nervous system adapted to that predictability. Modern marine mammals show layered behavioral responses to disturbance. Dolphins change vocalization patterns when unfamiliar objects enter water. Seals retreat to land. Whales alter dive rhythms. Even manatees, often considered gentle and slow, react strongly to approaching boats after repeated encounters. They learn avoidance. The sea cow did not. Historical descriptions repeatedly emphasize the same observation. The animals allowed humans to approach extremely close, even after witnessing others being killed nearby. Some individuals attempted to support wounded companions rather than flee. Groups remained clustered instead of dispersing, which made subsequent hunting easier. From a human perspective, this appears almost compassionate. From an evolutionary perspective, it indicates the absence of a flight framework. The species' social behavior was built for stability, not threat distribution. Group living offered thermoregulation and calf protection in calm ecosystems. But in the presence of a new predator, clustering concentrates vulnerability. This pattern appears in other extinction events. Island birds that evolved without mammalian predators often showed similar tameness when humans arrived. The difference is scale. The sea cow was one of the largest herbivorous mammals on Earth, yet behaved like an animal from a predator-free island. Its metabolism reinforced this calmness. Because kelp is low-energy food, the sea cow maintained a slow metabolic pace. Sudden high-energy bursts were physiologically expensive. Evolution, therefore, favored steady movement and minimal excitement. Rapid escape responses would have consumed energy better spent on digestion and insulation. So the animal did not merely lack fear. Fear had been selected against. An organism constantly reacting to harmless disturbances wastes energy over countless generations. Individuals that remained calm fed more efficiently and survived winters better. Gradually, heightened alertness disappeared from the population. When humans arrived, the animals were not choosing bravery over caution. They had no inherited reason to interpret humans as danger. Learning could have changed this, but learning requires survivors who pass behavior to others. Hunting methods prevented that process. Crews targeted groups repeatedly, removing experienced adults first. Calves and remaining individuals never accumulated generations of avoidance behavior before the population collapsed. This created a feedback loop of extinction. No fear, easy hunting, rapid adult mortality, no behavioral transmission, continued lack of fear. At the same time, reproduction could not compensate. Long gestation and low birth rates meant population recovery required decades without disturbance. Instead, disturbance occurred continuously during hunting seasons. Each year removed more breeding adults than could be replaced. A species built for slow equilibrium faced fast depletion. But even without human hunting, the species was already approaching ecological fragility. Climate variation had reduced its distribution to a single region. Kelp forests remained, but their extent fluctuated with storms and temperature shifts. Normally, a species could relocate along coastlines. The sea cow's limited mobility and historical contraction prevented expansion. It lived inside what ecologists call a terminal niche, a habitat where survival is possible only while conditions remain nearly identical to the past. Such niches can persist for enormous time spans and then vanish quickly. When they vanish, species adapted exclusively to them have no gradient of adaptation to follow. There is no intermediate lifestyle available. A whale can shift prey species. A seal can move breeding grounds. A generalist herbivore can alter diet composition. The sea cow could only continue grazing kelp in shallow cold water. Remove access, and its evolutionary options equaled zero. This is why its extinction feels sudden in historical records. The final decades were not a gradual decline, but a tipping point. Population size had already shrunk over millennia. Human exploitation merely accelerated the last stage beyond recovery. By the late 1760s, sightings stopped. Not because the environment collapsed entirely, kelp forests still existed, but because the number of individuals dropped below reproductive viability. Social animals require minimum population density to find mates and maintain calf survival. Once that threshold passed, extinction became inevitable even without further hunting. The species had reached the end point of specialization. Perfect adaptation to a past environment combined with inability to respond to a new one. Other marine mammals balanced efficiency with flexibility. The sea cow chose efficiency alone, and that choice, written slowly across evolutionary time, determined its fate long before the first human ship appeared on the horizon. In the next chapter, we will examine the specific trade-offs created by extreme specialization, what the sea cow gained, what it lost, and why those losses mattered only at the very end. Every evolutionary advantage is purchased. Nothing in biology is free, not speed, not strength, not intelligence, not even size. When a species becomes exceptionally good at one task, it almost always becomes worse at another. Most of the time, that compromise remains invisible because the environment rewards the specialization. The sea cow represents one of the clearest demonstrations of this principle. For millions of years, it possessed a powerful advantage, unmatched efficiency in a stable kelp ecosystem. But that advantage required surrendering abilities other marine mammals kept in reserve. The trade-off was simple. The sea cow gained certainty. It lost options. To see why this matters, imagine two survival strategies. One organism invests energy in flexibility, multiple food sources, strong sensory awareness, mobility across environments. Another invests energy in optimization, perfect efficiency within a single condition, In stable conditions, the optimizer always wins. It wastes no energy on unused abilities. It feeds better, survives winters better, reproduces steadily, but when conditions shift, flexibility becomes more valuable than efficiency. The sea cow evolved as the ultimate optimizer. Its enormous body size appears at first to be a general advantage. Large animals retain heat well in cold water and resist predation. But size also creates dependency. Large herbivores must consume vast quantities of food daily. If their specific food disappears locally, they cannot switch quickly to alternatives. Whales solve this with migration. Manatees solve it with broad plant diets. Fertilize them, currents stabilize temperature, and shallow, rocky coastlines provided attachment surfaces. The sea cow's digestive system adapted to extract minimal nutrients from massive volumes of plant matter. Its gut bacteria specialized for kelp breakdown. Its feeding behavior became nearly continuous. But that digestive efficiency required monotony. Introduce unfamiliar plants, and the system becomes less effective. Introduce scarcity, and the animal cannot accelerate metabolism enough to compensate. Introduce migration, and energy expenditure exceeds intake. So the species traded versatility for efficiency. Another trade-off involved defense. Most large marine mammals rely on one of three protection strategies: speed, group escape, coordination, or deep-water refuge. The sea cow possessed none. Instead, it relied on absence of predators. In evolutionary time, absence functions as a form of protection. If attacks never occur, defensive traits decay because maintaining them wastes resources. Fast muscles require high metabolism. Acute fear responses increase stress hormones. Vigilance reduces sudden lethal threats. When a predator finally appeared that did not resemble any past threat, the system could not categorize it. The third trade-off was reproductive speed. Species facing unpredictable environments reproduce quickly. Species facing stable environments reproduce slowly and invest heavily in each offspring. The sea cow followed the second path to an extreme. Calves developed under prolonged maternal care. Adults lived long lives with low natural mortality. This is efficient only while adult survival remains high. The moment adult mortality rises rapidly, population collapse accelerates because births cannot compensate. In modern ecology, this distinction separates resilient species from fragile ones. Resilient populations recover after disturbance. Fragile populations continue declining even if disturbance stops, simply because too few individuals remain to sustain reproduction. By the 18th century, the sea cow had crossed that threshold. The environment had not yet vanished, but redundancy had. Only a single geographic refuge remained. That meant every individual carried disproportionate importance to species survival. Removing even a few adults yearly created long-term instability. Human hunting did not merely reduce numbers. Memory indicated that rapid, large-scale change could occur within a lifetime. Humans introduced change faster than instinct could interpret. So the fatal trade-off becomes clear. The sea cow became perfectly adapted to a world that changed slowly, and therefore incapable of surviving a world that changed quickly. At this point, it is tempting to say humans alone caused extinction, but the deeper truth is more complex. Many animals hunted by humans survive because their biology contains alternative strategies. The sea cow's biology contained only one. Human arrival did not create vulnerability. It revealed it. In the next part, we will examine the specific abilities the species abandoned during its specialization abilities other marine mammals retained, and that ultimately allowed them to persist where the sea cow vanished. Every evolutionary advantage is purchased. Nothing in biology is free. Not speed, not strength, not intelligence, not even size. When a species becomes exceptionally good at one task, it almost always becomes worse at another. Most of the time, that compromise remains invisible because the environment rewards the specialization. The sea cow represents one of the clearest demonstrations of this principle. For millions of years, it possessed a powerful advantage: unmatched efficiency in a stable kelp ecosystem. But that advantage required surrendering abilities other marine mammals kept in reserve. The trade-off was simple. The sea cow gained certainty. It lost options. To see why this matters, imagine two survival strategies. One organism invests energy in flexibility, multiple food sources, strong sensory awareness, mobility across environments. Another invests energy in optimization, perfect efficiency within a single condition. In stable conditions, the optimizer always wins. It wastes no energy on unused abilities. It feeds better, survives winters better, reproduces steadily. But when conditions shift, flexibility becomes more valuable than efficiency. The sea cow evolved as the ultimate optimizer. Its enormous body size appears at first to be a general advantage. Large animals retain heat well in cold water and resist predation. But size also creates dependency. Large herbivores must consume vast quantities of food daily. If their specific food disappears locally, they cannot switch quickly to alternatives. Whales solve this with migration. Manatees solve it with broad plant diets. The sea cow solved it by assuming its food would always exist nearby. And for geological ages, that assumption worked. The kelp forests of the North Pacific were extraordinarily productive. Storm cycles fertilized them, currents stabilized temperature, and shallow, rocky coastlines provided attachment surfaces. The sea cow's digestive system adapted to extract minimal nutrients from massive volumes of plant matter. Its gut bacteria specialized for kelp breakdown. Its feeding behavior became nearly continuous. But that digestive efficiency required monotony. Introduce unfamiliar plants, and the system becomes less effective. Introduce scarcity, and the animal cannot accelerate metabolism enough to compensate. Introduce migration, and energy expenditure exceeds intake. So the species traded versatility for efficiency. Another trade-off involved defense. Most large marine mammals rely on one of three protection strategies: speed, group escape, coordination, or deep water refuge. The sea cow possessed none. Instead, it relied on absence of predators. In evolutionary time, absence functions as a form of protection. If attacks never occur, defensive traits decay because maintaining them wastes resources. Fast muscles require high metabolism, acute fear responses increase stress hormones, vigilance reduces feeding time. Over many generations, Calmer individuals outcompete anxious ones in safe environments. Thus, the sea cow became behaviorally tranquil. This tranquility is often described as gentleness, but biologically it is a removed alarm system. The animal's neural responses were tuned to detect environmental patterns, currents, contact, and social signals, rather than sudden lethal threats. When a predator finally appeared that did not resemble any past threat, the system could not categorize it. The third trade-off was reproductive speed. Species facing unpredictable environments reproduce quickly. Species facing stable environments reproduce slowly and invest heavily in each offspring. The sea cow followed the second path to an extreme. Calves developed under prolonged maternal care. Adults lived long lives with low natural mortality. This is efficient only while adult survival remains high. The moment adult mortality rises rapidly, population collapse accelerates because births cannot compensate. In modern ecology, this distinction separates resilient species from fragile ones. Resilient populations recover after disturbance. Fragile populations continue declining even if disturbance stops, simply because too few individuals remain to sustain reproduction. By the 18th century, the sea cow had crossed that threshold. The environment had not yet vanished, but redundancy had. Only a single geographic refuge remained. That meant every individual carried disproportionate importance to species survival. Removing even a few adults yearly created long-term instability. Human hunting did not merely reduce numbers, it removed the buffering capacity evolution depends on. But the most subtle trade-off involved perception of time. Animals in dynamic ecosystems operate on short feedback loops. Daily changes matter. They constantly evaluate surroundings. Animals in stable ecosystems operate on long feedback loops. Immediate variation rarely signals danger. The sea cow's behavioral rhythms were slow hours feeding, long resting intervals, minimal relocation. Nothing in its evolutionary memory indicated that rapid, large-scale change could occur within a lifetime. Humans introduced change faster than instinct could interpret. So the fatal trade-off becomes clear. The sea cow became perfectly adapted to a world that changed slowly and therefore incapable of surviving a world that changed quickly. At this point, it is tempting to say humans alone caused extinction, but the deeper truth is more complex. Many animals hunted by humans survive because their biology contains alternative strategies. The sea cow's biology contained only one. Human arrival did not create vulnerability, it revealed it. In the next part, we will examine the specific abilities the species abandoned. During its specialization abilities, other marine mammals retained, and that ultimately allowed them to persist where the sea cow vanished. The sea cow did not suddenly become vulnerable when humans arrived. It had been surrendering survival abilities gradually for millions of years, not through weakness, but through success. Each generation that lived safely in stable kelp forests passed on traits favoring efficiency over readiness. Eventually, what remained was an animal that could live extremely well in one condition and almost nowhere else. To understand how extreme this became, we can compare it trait by trait with other marine mammals that still exist today. Start with movement. Even the slowest whales can produce powerful acceleration when threatened. Their massive muscles exist not only for migration, but also for emergency escape. Seals, though clumsy on land, can twist and pivot rapidly underwater. Manatees appear slow but can surge forward with surprising speed when startled. The sea cow could not. Its musculature emphasized endurance, not bursts. The tail produced steady propulsion suitable for grazing routes, but not evasive maneuvers. Its enormous body mass, combined with dense bones, created inertia that resisted rapid directional change. In open water, this might only mean sluggishness. In shallow coastal feeding zones, it meant capture. Next, spatial awareness. Many marine mammals constantly scan surroundings through sound and motion detection. Dolphins echolocate continuously. Whales monitor pressure waves over distance. Seals react to water vibrations long before visual contact. The sea cow relied heavily on proximity sensation, contact, low-frequency social sound, and immediate surroundings. That works in kelp forests, where obstacles are constant but threats historically absent. It fails against approaching hunters who operate from above water, beyond its sensory focus. Then consider habitat use. Most marine mammals maintain multiple behavioral zones: feeding areas, resting areas, breeding areas. If disturbance occurs in one zone, they relocate to another. The sea cow's zones overlapped completely. It fed, rested, and socialized in the same shallow coastal strips. Because food existed there continuously, there was nowhere else to go. Even diving ability, one of the most basic marine defenses, had faded. Whales dive to depth to escape. Seals dive and surface unpredictably. The sea cow's buoyancy control and lung structure favored near-surface existence. Its feeding plants grew near light, so deep water offered no advantage and likely physiological stress. Vertical escape was not an option. Dietary flexibility had also vanished. Herbivores often maintained secondary foods for scarcity periods. Terrestrial grazers browse shrubs when grass fails. Manatees switch aquatic vegetation depending on region. The sea cow consumed kelp almost exclusively. Its digestive microbes, jaw structure, and feeding behavior all converged on this single resource. When storms temporarily disrupted kelp beds, individuals likely endured short shortages, but long-term change would have been impossible to overcome. Finally, reproduction and learning. Species exposed to predators evolve cultural transmission. Calves learn avoidance routes and danger signals. Many whales teach migration paths across generations. Seals imprint safe haul-out sites. Even herbivores on land teach young to recognize threats. The sea cow's social behavior emphasized cohesion rather than instruction. Groups stayed together because historically safety lay in staying near food, not escaping danger. When hunting began, calves inherited no behavioral toolkit for evasion because none had existed previously. All these lost abilities share a common cause: lack of selective pressure to maintain them. Natural selection preserves costly traits only if they improve survival. If an ability remains unused for immense spans of time, individuals lacking it may actually fare better because they conserve energy. Over evolutionary time, the population shifts toward minimal necessary function. The sea cow became minimal not in body size, but in behavioral repertoire, and this created a biological trap. A flexible species encountering change shifts along a spectrum of behaviors until new equilibrium forms. A hyper-specialized species has no spectrum. It occupies a single point. If conditions move away from that point, adaptation cannot occur within meaningful time. When humans began hunting beneficial traits, the sea cow produced none rapidly enough. This is why the extinction feels abrupt in historical records. From human perspective, it seemed abundant and then suddenly gone. From evolutionary perspective, the decline had been inevitable, since the species narrowed its range and behavior thousands of years earlier. Hunting was merely the final trigger applied to a system already balanced at its limit. In the next part, we will connect these biological losses to their broader ecological consequence, how an animal perfectly integrated into its environment became dependent on that environment, remaining unchanged forever. At first glance, the sea cow looks like a triumph of evolution. It lived for millions of years. It reached enormous size. It occupied a stable ecological role. It required little energy for survival. By ordinary standards, that is success. But evolution does not measure success by longevity alone. It measures success by persistence through change. And here lies the paradox. The better the sea cow became at living in its environment, the more it required that environment never change. Adaptation had crossed into dependence. To understand this boundary, consider how ecosystems normally function. Most species interact with multiple environmental factors, temperature ranges, varied food sources, alternative shelter locations. Each factor provides a margin of error. When one fluctuates, others compensate. The sea cow removed those margins one by one. Its food source narrowed to kelp forests in shallow cold water. Its movement narrowed to slow coastal cruising. Its behavior narrowed to calm group feeding. Its reproduction narrowed to slow replacement cycles. Its perception narrowed to immediate surroundings. Individually, none of these are fatal traits. Many organisms specialize, but survival requires that at least one trait remains flexible enough to respond when conditions shift. The sea cow had none remaining. Ecologists describe this condition as ecological locking. A species becomes so integrated into a particular environmental structure that it can no longer function outside it. The relationship stops being adaptive and becomes obligatory. In earlier ages, this lock was stable because the kelp ecosystem itself was stable. Cold currents, nutrient upwelling, and coastline structure maintained it across vast distances. Even climate oscillations altered distribution gradually, allowing slow adjustment. But toward the end of the last ice age, change accelerated. Sea levels rose rapidly on geological timescales. Coastlines flooded. Shallow feeding areas fragmented into isolated patches. Instead of continuous habitat, islands of suitable environment remained. The sea cow's population did not vanish immediately. Instead, it retreated into the last region where conditions still resembled its ancient world. The Commander Islands were not its ideal habitat, they were its final, compatible one. Here is where dependence becomes visible. A flexible species would have expanded or altered diet. The sea cow concentrated. Its entire remaining population lived in one narrow geographic corridor. Local abundance created the illusion of security, but the species had lost global resilience. From that moment, extinction required only a single persistent pressure. Humans provided that pressure, but the mechanism was already prepared. Each animal removed represented a permanent loss because no distant populations existed to replace it. Each breeding pair mattered disproportionately. Each year of hunting compounded previous years without recovery time. The species did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it had no alternative state. Think of a bridge designed for one exact load weight. Under that load, it stands forever. Add slightly more, and it fails completely, not gradually bending, but breaking. Once tolerance passes a narrow threshold, the sea cow lived at that threshold. Its entire evolutionary history assumed slow environmental change and absence of novel predators. When both assumptions failed simultaneously, climate-driven range contraction followed by human exploitation, extinction became mathematically unavoidable. This reframes the common question. The issue is not why humans hunted it. The issue is why the species could not absorb even small levels of loss. Many marine mammals were hunted intensively during later centuries, yet survived because their biology allowed recovery. Migration dispersed risk, faster reproduction replaced numbers, avoidance behavior reduced future mortality. The sea cow possessed none of these buffers. Its extinction, therefore, represents not merely overhunting, but exposure of an evolutionary extreme, a species optimized beyond flexibility, and this leads to a broader realization. Evolution does not design organisms for unpredictable futures. It refines them for repeated pasts. If the past remains consistent, specialization increases indefinitely. If the world changes faster than adaptation can follow, the most specialized organisms disappear first, even if they dominated for millions of years. The sea cow stands at that boundary between adaptation and dependence. It survived nearly unchanged across vast stretches of geological time, only to vanish within a human lifetime once the pace of change exceeded its capacity to respond. In the next chapter, we will reconstruct the environment that once protected it, the ancient Kelp world, where its strategy made perfect sense, and why that world itself began to vanish before humans ever saw the animal. To understand why the sea cow's strategy worked for so long, we have to imagine a coastline that no longer truly exists, not simply colder, not simply richer, but structured differently from modern oceans. During much of the late Cenozoic era, the northern Pacific Rim supported what biologists sometimes call a continuous kelp highway. From the coasts of Japan, across Kamchatka, the Aleutians, Alaska, and down toward North America, stretched an almost unbroken chain of shallow, rocky shores. These were not scattered patches of vegetation, they formed immense underwater forests, dense enough to shape currents, trap nutrients, and calm wave energy near the surface. Inside these forests, the ocean behaved more like a sheltered valley than open water. Storm waves lost strength, moving through thick fronds. Sediment settled instead of dispersing. Sunlight filtered downward in consistent patterns. Temperatures fluctuated slowly compared to open sea conditions. Entire communities evolved around that stability. Fish, invertebrates, seabirds, and grazing mammals. The sea cow was not an isolated organism in this system. It was a central component, By feeding constantly on kelp canopy growth, it prevented overshading of lower layers. This allowed new shoots to grow, maintaining forest productivity. Its waste recycled nutrients into shallow zones. Trails carved through vegetation created passages used by fish and smaller animals. In effect, the animal was part gardener, part regulator. And in such a stable environment, natural selection favored long-term balance over rapid response. A species did not need speed or caution if the ecosystem itself dampened sudden danger. This stability lasted for immense spans of time because climate oscillations occurred gradually. Ice ages came and went, but coastlines shifted slowly relative to generational turnover. Populations could redistribute over centuries without facing abrupt habitat loss. Then the last glacial period ended and change accelerated. As continental ice sheets melted, sea levels rose dramatically, sometimes meters within a few centuries. Shallow platforms that once hosted kelp were submerged too deeply for sunlight penetration. Elsewhere, retreating ice exposed new rock but without mature ecological communities. Ocean circulation patterns altered, shifting nutrient flows and seasonal temperature gradients. The kelp highway fractured. Instead of continuity, there were separated segments. Some expanded briefly, others vanished entirely. For mobile species, this meant relocation. For the sea cow, it meant contraction. Fossil evidence suggests its ancestors once occupied wide ranges across the North Pacific. But over thousands of years, those populations disappeared one by one as suitable coastal structure became patchy. Eventually, only the Commander Islands retained the precise combination of depth, temperature, nutrient upwelling, and shelter necessary to support a permanent population. From an ecological perspective, this was a refuge habitat. Refuges allow species to survive environmental transitions, but they also isolate them. Genetic exchange stops, population numbers stabilize at lower levels, resilience declines because all individuals depend on the same local conditions. Yet inside that refuge, life still appeared abundant. Kelp grew thickly in the cold, nutrient-rich water. The sea cows continued their routines unchanged. To an observer within that region, nothing seemed wrong. But stability inside a shrinking refuge hides a dangerous truth. Survival now depends on absence of disturbance. In earlier eras, if storms destroyed local kelp beds, neighboring populations recolonized. If disease reduced numbers, migration replenished them. After contraction, no such recovery mechanisms remained. The species had transitioned from widespread dominance to single-point persistence. And this change happened long before humans ever arrived. By the 18th century, when sailors encountered the animal, they were not discovering a flourishing species, they were encountering the last enclave of a once expansive lineage, preserved temporarily by a unique oceanographic setting. The world that shaped the sea cow still existed there, but nowhere else. This distinction matters because extinction rarely begins at the moment a species disappears. It begins when its distribution becomes narrow enough that chance events can eliminate it entirely. At the Commander Islands, the ecosystem remained productive, but it was fragile in scale. Severe storms could temporarily reduce kelp cover. Harsh winters could stress food availability. Normally, such pressures would be survivable. But once an additional pressure entered a persistent new predator, the margin vanished. In the next part, we will explore how the sea cow's role within this ecosystem tied its fate not only to its own biology, but to the stability of the kelp forest itself, a stability that was already weakening. The sea cow did not merely live inside the kelp forest. It depended on the forest functioning in a very particular way. In most ecosystems, species can tolerate moderate imbalance. If plant growth drops temporarily, herbivores migrate. If predators increase, prey disperses. Energy flows shift but continue. The kelp forest that sustained the sea cow operated differently. Its balance relied on structural stability more than constant replacement. Kelp forests are unusual among marine environments because they behave like three-dimensional architecture. Their tall fronds form canopies near the surface, middle layers of drifting leaves, and anchored holdfasts attached to rock. Each layer hosts different organisms. Fish hide in the mid-zone. Invertebrates cling near the base. Seabirds hunt above, and large grazers feed along the upper edges. The sea cow specialized in trimming the canopy. By eating upper fronds rather than uprooting plants, it prevented excessive shading. Without grazing pressure, thick surface mats block sunlight, weakening lower growth and eventually destabilizing the forest. With moderate grazing, light reaches deeper layers and productivity remains high. In other words, the sea cow helped maintain the very habitat it required. This feedback loop worked for immense spans of time because both the animal and the forest evolved together. The plants tolerated grazing, the animal relied on regrowth. Neither overwhelmed the other. Stability reinforced stability. But such equilibrium assumes gradual change. After post-glacial sea level rise fragmented coastlines, local conditions became more variable. Storms periodically removed large sections of canopy, temperature shifts altered growth cycles. In larger historical ranges, neighboring kelp beds would reseed damaged ones. In the restricted Commander Islands refuge, recovery depended entirely on local persistence. The sea cow could still feed because enough kelp regrew each season. However, the system's margin narrowed. Now imagine a second disturbance layered onto this delicate balance. Continuous removal of the largest grazers. At first, human hunting might appear to benefit the kelp forest. Fewer herbivores mean more plant growth. But ecosystems rarely respond so simply. Without canopy trimming, dense surface mats form, increasing drag from waves. During storms, these heavier mats tear away more violently, removing holdfasts and exposing rock. The result is not expansion but instability, alternating overgrowth and collapse. This likely occurred during the final decades of the sea cow's existence. Historical records mention fluctuating availability. Sometimes many animals were seen. Later, far fewer along the same coasts. Such patterns align with localized habitat disturbance rather than uniform decline. But the species had no secondary habitat. If feeding grounds temporarily degraded, relocation options were minimal. Even short-distance shifts along coastline required energy reserves the animals did not maintain because historically they never needed to. So the ecosystem that once buffered environmental change now amplified it. Reduced grazing destabilized kelp, Destabilized kelp reduced feeding efficiency, and reduced feeding efficiency weakened already declining populations. And this happened while hunting continued. Unlike natural predators, humans do not stop hunting when prey becomes scarce. Scarcity often increases effort. Each expedition sought remaining individuals, removing survivors who might otherwise rebuild numbers during favorable years. The sea cow faced a combined pressure: biological inflexibility and ecological contraction. Yet from the human viewpoint at the time, nothing seemed extraordinary. The animals were large, slow, and locally plentiful. There were no warnings that this was the final population on Earth. The disappearance appeared gradual across decades, not days. But extinction does not require dramatic catastrophe. It requires a system where losses accumulate faster than recovery under conditions that once required no recovery at all. The kelp forest had protected the sea cow by eliminating sudden threats. Once disturbances became frequent, climate variability plus human exploitation, the protective environment transformed into a dependency trap. The animal could neither adapt its behavior nor relocate its habitat. By the time numbers became visibly low, the ecological processes sustaining them were already unstable. In the next part, we will examine how this fragile equilibrium met the decisive pressure, sustained human presence, and why the sea cow's evolutionary history left it uniquely unable to respond even once danger became obvious. For thousands of years after its range contracted, the sea cow persisted in a narrow but workable balance. The kelp forests still regenerated. The population remained small but steady. Occasional environmental stress did not push it past recovery. The species was no longer secure, but it was surviving. Then the nature of disturbance changed. Natural pressures tend to fluctuate. A harsh winter may reduce numbers, followed by milder years, allowing recovery. Storm cycles damage habitat, but also fertilize it. Even predators rarely remove individuals faster than reproduction over long periods, because predator numbers depend on prey availability. Human activity operates differently. Humans do not form part of the feedback loop that stabilizes ecological systems. When a new resource is found, exploitation often increases precisely as available. They unknowingly introduced a permanent mortality factor. Each year removed breeding adults regardless of population size or seasonal condition. The sea cow had never faced a constant predator, and its biology assumed that if individuals survived to adulthood, they would live long lives. This assumption governed its reproductive strategy. Slow gestation, extended maternal care, and strong calf bonding worked perfectly in an environment where adult survival approached certainty. But under repeated hunting pressure, those same traits produced accelerating decline. Every adult killed represented decades of lost future offspring. Every calf dependent on a mother had little chance if she died early. The species could not shift to earlier reproduction or larger litters within a few generations. Evolutionary changes require time proportional to lifespan and generational turnover. A long-lived animal adapts slowly, and only if survivors reproduce successfully. But hunting methods targeted accessible groups along shorelines, removing experienced adults first. Younger individuals remained, but lacked social continuity. Population age structure collapsed. This kind of collapse often appears deceptively gradual. For a period, animals are still seen regularly. Then suddenly, sightings drop sharply. The tipping point occurs when too few mature individuals remain to sustain breeding density. Historical accounts suggest exactly this pattern. Early visitors described numerous groups along coasts. Later expeditions reported difficulty finding them. Finally, reports ceased entirely within a few years. The environment had not vanished. The behavior had not changed. The species simply passed below viable population size. What makes this moment significant is not merely the hunting itself, but the absence of behavioral response even after repeated encounters. Many species alter migration routes, shift activity times, or abandon feeding grounds once danger becomes predictable. The sea cow continued appearing in the same shallow locations year after year. Its evolutionary history offered no framework for interpreting persistent predation by a surface-based hunter using tools. Each generation behaved as though conditions remained ancient and safe. The stability that once protected it became informational blindness. By the late 1760s, the last individuals were killed. There was no dramatic final event, no storm, no disease outbreak, no visible catastrophe. The species ended quietly because the number of living animals fell to zero before any adaptive response could arise. In geological time, its disappearance was instantaneous. This is why the sea cow represents more than overhunting. It represents the collision between two different tempos of change. One species, shaped by millions of years of slow environmental adjustment, encountered another capable of transforming ecosystems within decades. The outcome was not a struggle, it was incompatibility. In the next chapter, we move to the human perspective, how explorers, traders, and hunters perceived the animal, and why its unusual behavior made extinction almost inevitable once contact began. When humans first encountered the sea cow, they did not recognize it as rare, they recognized it as useful. To understand why extinction followed so quickly, we have to step into the mindset of 18th century sailors in the North Pacific. Voyages across those waters were long, unpredictable, and dangerous. Crews frequently suffered from scurvy, starvation, and exposure. Ships carried preserved food, but months at sea degraded supplies. Fresh meat meant survival. So when stranded survivors discovered enormous animals living directly along the shoreline, animals that did not flee and could feed an entire crew, they did not see an ecological anomaly. They saw security. The sea cow existed exactly where exhausted crews needed it, most shallow coastal waters near landing points. Unlike seals, it did not scramble onto rocks requiring pursuit. Unlike whales, it did not require specialized equipment or coordinated hunting. A small boat, a harpoon, and patience were sufficient. And patience was easy, because the animal did not resist effectively. Hunters recorded that the sea cows often remained near the surface even while injured. Others stayed nearby, circling slowly. This behavior reduced effort dramatically. Instead of chasing scattered prey, hunters returned to the same feeding grounds repeatedly. In practical terms, the species functioned as a stationary food reserve. News of this spread quickly through maritime networks. The Commander Islands became known not just as geographic landmarks, but as provisioning stops. Ships traveling between Asia and North America incorporated planned hunting visits into their routes. This shift matters. Occasional hunting might not have destroyed the population immediately, but scheduled, repeated harvesting converts wildlife into a resource extraction system. Each visit removed animals regardless of seasonal recovery. There was no concept of population management. The assumption was abundance, and locally, abundance appeared real. The animals gathered in groups large enough to give that impression. Yet, the total global population likely numbered only in the low thousands, perhaps fewer. When distribution is narrow, density deceives observers. Removing dozens each season seems insignificant, while entire species decline invisibly. Another factor: accelerated exploitation. Predictability. Sea cows followed habitual feeding cycles tied to kelp growth. They returned to the same locations, often the same stretches of shoreline. Hunters did not need to search vast areas. Once a group was located, future visits found them again. Predictability is efficient in nature. Migration routes, breeding grounds, feeding sites all depend on it. But in the presence of humans, predictability becomes vulnerability. The animals also floated after death because of thick blubber layers. Carcasses could be processed on shore without sinking losses. Fat rendered into oil, burned cleanly, valuable for lamps and cooking. Skin could be shaped into coverings for boats or shelters. Nothing was wasted, and nothing required advanced technology. In other words, the sea cow matched perfectly with the logistical needs of seafaring humans: high yield, low effort, reliable location. There is an important distinction here. Humans did not set out to exterminate the species. They simply behaved as they did toward any dependable resource. But, unlike other marine animals, the sea cow lacked the buffering traits that usually prevent rapid collapse: wide distribution, rapid breeding, or avoidance behavior. So the normal human pattern of use became lethal. Within only a few decades of regular visits, reports began noting fewer sightings along previously active coasts. Crews extended searches farther along the islands. Hunting trips lasted longer to locate remaining groups. Still, no one imagined extinction. The timescale felt too short to consider. For animals assumed ancient and plentiful, disappearance seemed impossible within a human lifetime. But that assumption depended on species capable of recovery. The sea cow was not one of them. In the next part, we will examine how its social structure, the very trait that once protected calves and maintained group stability, made the hunting process even more effective and accelerated the collapse. The sea cow did not live as scattered individuals. It lived as a community. Groups rested, fed, and moved slowly along the same coastal stretches, often maintaining physical contact. Adults positioned themselves around calves, and individuals supported one another near the surface. In a world without persistent predators, this behavior was efficient. Close grouping reduced heat loss in cold water and allowed calves to remain protected while learning feeding patterns. Social stability replaced vigilance. For most of the species' history, this worked perfectly. A lone grazer might miss feeding opportunities or drift from optimal kelp density. A group shared location knowledge simply by staying together. Survival depended on continuity rather than caution. But once hunting began, the same cohesion reversed its effect. When one animal was struck, It did not trigger dispersal. Others stayed nearby. Some circled the injured individual, occasionally lifting it toward the surface. From the human perspective, this meant a single successful hit often led to multiple captures in the same place. Hunters did not need to chase fleeing animals across kilometers of ocean. The herd provided its own concentration. Modern herd animals sometimes behave similarly when confronted with unfamiliar predators, but repeated encounters normally produce learning. Individuals that escape pass avoidance behavior to younger members. Gradually, the group becomes harder to approach. The sea cow never reached that stage. The reason lies in generational timing. Each hunting season removed mature adults, the animals most likely to have experienced previous encounters. Calves and juveniles survived temporarily, but lacked behavioral instruction. By the time they matured, they faced hunters again without inherited caution. Learning requires survivors across multiple generations. The sea cow's population declined too quickly for this to occur. Another aspect of social life increased vulnerability: site fidelity. Groups returned to habitual feeding areas day after day. These were not merely convenient locations, but necessary ones, where kelp growth matched their dietary needs. Hunters quickly mapped these areas and planned visits accordingly. Imagine a grazing animal on land that always returns to the same meadow, regardless of repeated danger. Over time, the meadow becomes a trap. That is effectively what happened along the Commander Islands shorelines. There was also no division between feeding and breeding grounds. Many marine species gather in vulnerable locations only briefly, then disperse widely. The sea cow's entire life occurred within the same shallow zones year-round. Every activity, feeding, resting, raising calves, happened in reachable water, so hunting pressure applied continuously to the entire population at once. This produced a compounding effect. Groups remained clustered, hunters removed, several individuals per encounter, surviving members lacked avoidance, learning groups returned to same location, future encounters repeated. Even without intentional over-harvesting, mathematics alone drove decline. A species reproducing slowly cannot withstand consistent adult mortality above a small threshold. The sea cow crossed that threshold almost immediately after regular hunting began. From human accounts, the animals did not show increasing fear over time. Boats approached repeatedly, and behavior remained similar. This does not indicate inability to feel pain or stress. It indicates absence of inherited escape strategy. Each encounter was treated as a local disturbance rather than a persistent existential threat. In a stable world, that interpretation was correct. In a changing world, it was fatal. By the time sailors noticed scarcity, the social structure that once ensured survival had already guaranteed collapse. The remaining individuals were too few and too isolated to form sustainable breeding groups. Even if hunting had stopped completely, recovery would have been uncertain. In the next part, we will look at the final phase, how observers gradually realized the animals were disappearing, and why, by then, the process could no longer be reversed. Extinction rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. There is no single day when observers suddenly realize they are witnessing the last members of a species. Instead, absence grows slowly inside routine. Fewer sightings one season, longer searches the next. Eventually, silence but by then memory fills the gaps with assumption. This is how the sea cow vanished. Early visiting crews described shorelines where animals could be found almost immediately after landing. Hunting required little planning. Meat and fat were gathered as part of normal provisioning before continuing voyages. The species felt permanent because each encounter looked similar to the last. Then the intervals began to stretch. Ships arrived and spent more time scanning coastlines before locating a group. Hunters traveled farther along the islands. A successful capture became noteworthy rather than expected. Still, no one interpreted this as the end of a species. To them, the animals were simply less convenient than before. The crucial misunderstanding was scale. Humans judged abundance locally what could be seen during a visit, but the sea cow no longer existed anywhere else. Each reduction was global, not regional. When a hunting party removed several adults, they were not thinning a population, they were subtracting from the entire species. Because visits occurred months apart, the decline was invisible between expeditions. The animals did not vanish overnight. They failed to recover between arrivals. With slow reproduction and long lifespans, missing individuals were not quickly replaced. Every year began with fewer adults than the previous one. By the mid-1762s, records noted difficulty finding animals where they had once been common. Observers began mentioning absence in specific bays. A few groups remained, but sightings were isolated. No coordinated protection followed, not out of cruelty, but because extinction as a concept barely existed in practical thought. The natural world was assumed inexhaustible on human timescales. If animals became scarce, they would eventually return. But recovery requires survivors beyond the reach of disturbance. The sea cow had none. In 1768, less than 3 decades after its scientific description, the last confirmed individual was killed. There was no ceremony, no recognition of finality. Only later did naturalists realize that new expeditions failed to locate even a single animal. What makes this event unusual is its speed relative to evolutionary time. A lineage that persisted through climatic shifts and geological changes disappeared within one human generation once consistent exploitation began. The disappearance did not require advanced industry or large populations, only repeated visits and biological inflexibility. And by the time awareness formed, it no longer mattered. The species had crossed the point where recovery was biologically possible. Too few individuals remained to maintain breeding density, and the remaining habitat could not support rapid growth even if hunting stopped immediately. The sea cow did not collapse in a dramatic catastrophe. It simply did not appear again. In the next chapter, we will step back from the historical narrative and examine the broader implications, why this extinction reveals a particular kind of evolutionary failure different from most others. Most extinctions we learn about feel distant. Dinosaurs disappeared 66 million years ago. Ice Age mammals faded thousands of years before written history in most regions. We reconstruct them from fossils, sediment layers, and indirect evidence. Their endings belong to geological time, slow, abstract, and separated from human observation. The sea cow is different. Its extinction unfolded within recorded memory. People described living animals, hunted them repeatedly, and then noticed their absence within the same lifetime. For perhaps the first time, humans encountered a vanishing species not as myth or ancient remains, but as a sequence of ordinary events accumulating toward an irreversible outcome. This makes the sea cow historically important beyond biology. It marks one of the earliest moments when human activity intersected visibly with evolutionary permanence. Yet even then, the significance was not immediately understood. To the hunters and sailors involved, nothing extraordinary occurred. They were not clearing forests, building cities, or introducing large-scale industry. They were performing routine survival behavior, harvesting a dependable food source encountered during voyages. The technology was simple. The numbers of people involved were small, and still the species vanished. This challenges a common assumption. Extinction requires massive destructive force. In reality, extinction requires mismatch between removal rate and replacement rate. When a population cannot recover as fast as individuals are lost, even modest pressure becomes terminal over time. The sea cow's biology amplified this mismatch. Long lifespan meant each adult represented decades of future reproduction. Low birth rate meant replacement required many years. Localized habitat meant losses applied globally. Predictable behavior ensured continued accessibility. None of these traits alone guarantee extinction. Together they eliminate resilience, so the process unfolded quietly. At first, animals were plentiful enough that hunting felt sustainable. Later, scarcity encouraged longer searches rather than restraint. By the time absence suggested a deeper problem, the remaining population was too small for recovery. Extinction did not appear as a sudden collapse. It appeared as a gradual inconvenience. This is a defining characteristic of real-time extinction events. Perception lags reality. Observers interpret declining encounters as fluctuation, not finality. Only after disappearance becomes complete does understanding form, but by then no corrective action can matter. Another important element is behavioral inertia. Even during the final years, there is no evidence the sea cows altered migration patterns, abandoned feeding sites, or developed avoidance responses. The species continued operating according to evolutionary rules written in a stable past. From the animal's perspective, each hunting event was isolated disturbance, not part of a repeating threat pattern. Humans recognized patterns faster than the species could evolve them. Evolution adapts populations through differential survival across generations. But when generational turnover is slow and mortality increases quickly, adaptation cannot propagate. The environment changes faster than natural selection can respond. In effect, history outran evolution. This is why the sea cow's extinction represents a new category compared to many prehistoric disappearances. It was not caused primarily by climate change, habitat destruction, or sudden catastrophe. Those factors weakened the species over millennia by narrowing its range. But the final elimination occurred because a stable adapted organism encountered a rapidly adaptive organism, humans operating on decision-making timescales instead of genetic ones. One species adjusted behavior daily. The other required centuries. The difference determined the outcome. In the next part, we will explore how this event changed scientific thinking, how naturalists began to realize that species were not permanent fixtures of Earth, and why the sea cow became an early example of human-driven extinction recognized after the fact. When the sea cow disappeared, people did not immediately call it extinction. At the time, the dominant belief about nature was permanence. Species were thought to be fixed parts of creation. Animals might become scarce locally, but the idea that an entire form of life could vanish everywhere was unfamiliar outside of philosophical speculation. Fossils existed, but many scholars interpreted them as remains of animals still living in distant, unexplored regions. So when expeditions returned from the Command Islands and failed to see sea cows, the first assumption was distance, not loss. Perhaps they had moved elsewhere. Perhaps they migrated seasonally. Perhaps observers simply searched the wrong coasts, but repeated absence accumulated. Naturalists compared earlier detailed descriptions with later reports that mentioned only bones on shorelines. Hunters, who had relied on the animals for provisioning, stopped expecting them. Gradually, the explanation narrowed. Not relocation, not hiding, but disappearing. This realization carried a conceptual shock. For the first time, a large mammal, known directly through observation, had ceased to exist within human memory. There was no ancient myth attached to it, no prehistoric time frame separating observers from the living creature. People had eaten it, described it, and then could not find it again. The sea cow helped transform extinction from theoretical possibility into documented event. And yet, understanding the cause lagged behind recognition of the outcome. Early discussions blamed simple overhunting, a reasonable explanation but incomplete. Overhunting alone does not erase every exploited species. Whales, seals, and many fish populations survived centuries of heavy harvesting before regulation existed. Something else had made this species uniquely vulnerable. Scientists eventually noticed the pattern: narrow habitat range, slow reproduction, lack of avoidance behavior, and ecological specialization. The animal had not been merely hunted, it had been exposed. Exposure means that a small change in mortality created irreversible decline because the species had no buffer capacity. It lived at equilibrium, where births roughly equaled natural deaths. Add a constant external loss, and the balance shifts permanently downward. This recognition contributed to a broader change in biological thinking. Species were not static objects placed into nature, they were outcomes of environmental conditions. Alter conditions beyond certain limits, and existence itself becomes temporary. The sea cow thus became more than a curiosity. It became evidence. Evidence that longevity does not guarantee permanence. Evidence that adaptation to past stability does not ensure survival in future instability. And importantly, evidence that human activity could operate as an evolutionary force, not gradually shaping species through selection alone, but abruptly ending lineages unable to respond. Yet this understanding arrived only after the last individual was gone. No living population remained to study behavior changes or recovery potential. Only written accounts and skeletal remains documented what had existed. The species had transitioned from ecology to history. In the next part, we will examine how this event fits into the larger pattern of evolutionary success and failure, and why, in a strict biological sense, the sea cow did not simply lose to humans, but to the speed of change itself. To say the sea cow was hunted to extinction is correct. To say that explains its disappearance is incomplete. Many animals have faced intense hunting pressure and survived long enough to recover once conditions improve. Some adapted behaviorally, others reproduced quickly, and some persisted because part of their population remained beyond human reach. The sea cow had none of those safeguards, but the deeper reason lies in something more fundamental. It evolved for a slow world and encountered a fast one. Evolution operates through generations. Human impact operates through decisions. This difference is crucial. For millions of years, the sea cow experienced environmental change only on geological timescales. Coastlines shifted gradually, climate warmed and cooled over thousands of years. Food availability varied seasonally but predictably. Under those conditions, the best strategy was efficiency, minimize energy waste, remain calm, reproduce steadily, and trust stability. Every trait reinforced that approach. But once humans entered the system, change accelerated beyond evolutionary response time. Hunting pressure appeared suddenly and repeated annually. Habitat disturbance intensified through human presence along coasts. The animal faced a novel predator capable of learning, planning, and returning deliberately. Natural selection could not keep pace. To adapt genetically, individuals with beneficial avoidance behaviors must survive and reproduce. Yet those most likely to learn from encounters, adults, were also the ones targeted and removed. Without surviving carriers of new behaviors, no adaptive trend could spread. The species was not given enough generations to change. This is the defining feature of being outpaced by time. Extinction occurs not because adaptation is impossible, but because it cannot happen quickly enough. Other marine mammals endured the same era. Whales eventually altered migration routes and later rebounded after protection. Seals shifted breeding colonies. Even slow-reproducing species survived because their geographic range allowed partial escape while adaptation occurred. The sea cow's range had already contracted to a single refuge, so the sequence unfolded like this. Environmental stability shaped specialization. Climate shifts reduced distribution. Population became localized. Humans introduced continuous mortality. Adaptation required time. Time was unavailable. In that chain, hunting was the final step, not the origin. This perspective reframes the concept of evolutionary failure. The sea cow did not fail because it was poorly designed. It was extraordinarily well designed for a persistent past environment. Failure arose when environmental tempo changed beyond the limits its design assumed. Evolution favors optimization under current conditions, not resilience to unknown futures. A species that invests entirely in one stable lifestyle becomes powerful within that niche, but fragile outside it. The sea cow reached that extreme. By the late 18th century, the species had crossed a boundary where recovery could not occur, even if hunting had ceased. Too few breeding individuals remained, and the slow reproductive cycle prevented rapid rebound. The final animals died in a world that still contained suitable kelp but lacked sufficient population to sustain itself. Extinction, therefore, resulted from mismatch, not merely exploitation. A long-lived, stable adapted organism encountered a rapidly changing ecological context driven by a flexible, technological species. The interaction lasted less than 30 years, negligible in evolutionary time, yet decisive. In the next chapter, we step back further to examine the broader lesson. Why evolution repeatedly produces species like the sea cow, and why extreme specialization continues to create vulnerability across the natural world. It is tempting to look at the sea cow and conclude evolution made a mistake. An animal perfectly designed for its environment disappears the moment the environment shifts that feels like failure. But evolution has no foresight. It does not prepare organisms for unpredictable futures. It selects traits that work now, based on past conditions, and preserves whatever improves immediate reproductive success. In a stable world, the optimal organism is not the most flexible one. It is the most efficient one. Efficiency wins because unused abilities cost energy. Maintaining strong escape reflexes, broad diets, high awareness, and rapid mobility requires metabolic investment. If threats never appear, individuals that do not carry those costs feed more effectively and reproduce more consistently. Over thousands of generations, populations become streamlined towards certainty. The sea cow was the logical result of such selection. Its environment rewarded calmness, slow metabolism, predictable movement, and dietary specialization. Any individual more cautious or more active would waste energy reacting to harmless conditions. Gradually, traits supporting versatility disappeared because they provided no advantage within that context. So evolution did not fail the sea cow. It succeeded perfectly for the world that existed during its formation. The problem emerges when conditions change faster than traits can re-diversify. Flexibility takes time to rebuild. Once lost, complex behaviors and anatomical capacities cannot return within a few generations. They require long sequences of mutations and selection pressures that only operate if enough individuals survive the transition. The sea cow never had that transition period, but this pattern is not unique. Across ecosystems, species at the peak of specialization often dominate for long durations and then vanish rapidly when environmental tempo shifts. Large herbivores adapted to uniform grasslands decline when landscapes fragment. Deep-sea organisms adapted to stable temperatures struggle under warming currents. Island birds without predators disappear after new predators arrive. In each case, the same mechanism operates. Stability removes the need for contingency plans. And contingency plans are what allow survival during novelty. There is a trade-off in evolutionary strategy between breadth and depth. Generalists operate across wide conditions, but rarely excel in any single one. Specialists excel within narrow parameters, but lose tolerance outside them. Neither approach is inherently superior. Success depends entirely on environmental predictability. For millions of years, the sea cow inhabited one of the most predictable habitats on Earth. Its specialization was rational within that context. But the arrival of a species capable of altering ecosystems intentionally changed the rules faster than natural processes ever had. From the animal's perspective, the environment stopped behaving according to the patterns written into its biology, and biology cannot renegotiate instantly. In the next part, we will compare this case to other species that survived similar pressures, not because they were stronger, but because they retained enough variability to adjust once conditions diverged from the past. The sea cow was not the only marine mammal humans hunted. Whales were pursued across entire oceans for centuries. Seals were harvested in massive numbers along coasts and ice fields. Even manatees and dugongs, close relatives of the sea cow, faced continuous exploitation in many regions. Yet those species survived. The difference was not intelligence, strength, or even initial population size. It was retained variability, the presence of alternative behaviors and habitats that allowed recovery after heavy losses. Start with whales. Many whale species migrate across enormous distances each year. Feeding grounds lie far from breeding grounds, often in remote waters difficult to reach consistently with early technology. When hunting pressure intensified in one region, other populations persisted elsewhere. Over time, surviving groups altered migration routes and timing, gradually reducing encounters with hunters. Their biology allowed partial escape. Seals offer another example. They divide life between land and sea. When certain haul-out beaches became dangerous, colonies relocated to less accessible coastlines or ice. Their reproduction rate, while not rapid compared to small animals, was sufficient to replace losses once pressure shifted. Behaviorally, seals learned avoidance quickly because enough individuals survived repeated encounters to transmit caution across generations. Even manatees slow. Gentle herbivores similar in appearance to the sea cow endured. The reason lies in habitat diversity. Manatees occupy rivers, estuaries, and coastal lagoons across wide geographic ranges. They can shift feeding areas when disturbance increases and consume varied aquatic plants rather than one primary species. Hunting reduced numbers severely in some places, but remote populations remained and eventually repopulated depleted regions. Each of these animals possessed what the sea cow lacked: redundancy. Redundancy means survival does not depend on one location, one behavior, or one response. When pressure removes part of the system, another part continues functioning. Recovery becomes possible because the species still exists somewhere under conditions allowing reproduction. The sea cow's evolutionary path eliminated redundancy almost completely. Its habitat narrowed to a single island chain. Its diet narrowed to a single plant group. Its movement narrowed to local coastal cruising. Its behavior narrowed to predictable routines. So when pressure appeared, there was nowhere beyond reach, and no alternative strategy to attempt. This comparison clarifies an important point. Extinction risk is not only about external threat intensity, but internal capacity for variation. A moderate threat can destroy a rigid system, while a severe threat may be survived by a flexible one. Humans did not hunt sea cows in vastly greater numbers than they hunted other marine mammals. They simply encountered a species with zero margin. In the next part, we will expand the lesson beyond marine life, why evolution repeatedly produces such vulnerable specialists, and why rapid environmental change today creates similar risks across many ecosystems. The sea cow is not an isolated story. It is a clear example of a broader evolutionary pattern, one that appears again and again whenever environments remain stable for long periods and then change quickly. Nature repeatedly produces species that become exceptionally good at a narrow way of living. And each time, Those species dominate their world until the world shifts faster than they can respond. The reason is simple. Stability rewards commitment. In a predictable environment, specialization always outcompetes flexibility. A generalist must divide its energy across multiple abilities, varied diet, wide awareness, adaptable movement. A specialist invests all resources into one system and therefore performs that system better. Over many generations, the specialist becomes more efficient and gradually replaces less optimized competitors. So ecosystems tend to move toward extremes when conditions stay constant long enough. Coral reefs create fish adapted to precise feeding niches. Grasslands produce grazers dependent on specific vegetation cycles. Deep oceans foster organisms tuned to unchanging pressure and temperature. For immense spans of time, these organisms flourish. Then the tempo of change increases. Sometimes the change is geological climate shifts or sea level movement. Sometimes biological new predators or competitors entering. Sometimes, as in recent history, technological human activity altering landscapes within decades. When tempo increases, the same specialization that once ensured success becomes constraint. Generalists adjust because they never abandoned variability. Specialists attempt to continue their established behavior because their biology contains no alternative. This is why extinction events often appear selective. Not all species vanish under stress. Those tied to narrow conditions disappear first, even if they were previously abundant and dominant. The sea cow reached the end point of that trajectory. It was not merely specialized, it was optimized to a single stable configuration of environment, behavior, and metabolism. Once the environment required rapid adjustment, there was nothing to adjust, and the pattern continues today. Whenever habitats shrink into isolated pockets, populations become dependent on local stability. Whenever food webs simplify, species lose fallback resources. Whenever conditions remain unchanged long enough, natural selection removes unused capabilities. None of this is error. It is the normal function of evolution. But it carries a consequence. Resilience decreases as efficiency increases. The sea cow's disappearance demonstrates the moment when efficiency and resilience diverged completely. It survived nearly unchanged for millions of years because the world matched its design. It vanished within decades when the world stopped matching. Not because the species was weak, because it was precise. In the final chapter, we will step back from the specific case and consider the broader message, what the sea cow reveals about survival, adaptation, and why evolution never promises permanence, only temporary fit. The extinction of the sea cow leaves a strange impression. It does not feel like a dramatic catastrophe. There was no volcanic eruption, no sudden ice sheet advance, no asteroid impact. The ocean it depended on still existed. The kelp forests still grew. The climate did not instantly collapse. Yet the species vanished completely. This is why the sea cow matters beyond its own history. It reveals a principle that is easy to overlook. Survival is not about strength or size or even long success. Survival depends on whether a species can tolerate change faster than it evolved to handle. For most of its existence, the sea cow lived in one of the safest ecological strategies imaginable. It occupied a food source that did not run away, in water where few predators could operate effectively, within an ecosystem that dampened sudden variation. Its slow metabolism and calm behavior were not disadvantages, they were logical responses to a stable world. If the pace of environmental change had remained geological, the species might still exist today. But evolution never builds organisms for future conditions. It shapes them from repeated past conditions. The sea cow's past was so consistent that adaptability itself became unnecessary. Over millions of years, unnecessary traits disappeared. That disappearance went unnoticed because nothing challenged it until something did. Humans did not introduce a new climate, a new ocean chemistry, or a new plant. They introduced a new tempo-repeated disturbance occurring within years rather than centuries. The environment stopped behaving according to the pattern encoded in the animal's biology. And once that happened, survival required flexibility the species no longer possessed. This transforms the meaning of extinction in this case. The sea cow did not fail to compete against another animal. It failed to keep pace with a rate of change outside evolutionary expectation. The difference is subtle but important. Predation can be countered with speed. Competition can be countered with efficiency. Climate shifts can be countered with migration. But tempo itself cannot be countered unless variation already exists. The sea cow's biology had converged on a single, stable configuration. There was no range of behaviors to select from, no unused capacity waiting to become useful. Evolution had refined away redundancy, and redundancy is what allows survival during uncertainty. In the next part, we will connect this idea to modern ecosystems, not as prediction, but as understanding why many living species today face pressures similar in structure, though different in detail, to the one that ended this lineage. The sea cow lived in a world where change accelerated suddenly. Today, that pattern appears across many ecosystems, not identical in details, but similar in structure. The important similarity is not the cause of change, but the speed relative to evolutionary adjustment. Evolutionary adaptation works across generations. Environmental shifts now often occur within a single generation. When those timescales separate too far, species encounter the same problem the sea cow faced. They are not immediately destroyed by conditions, but they cannot reorganize their behavior fast enough to remain viable. Consider habitat narrowing. When a species occupies a wide range, local disturbances rarely threaten total survival. But when populations become restricted to isolated pockets, every disturbance applies globally to that species. This mirrors the sea cow's final centuries, once widespread, eventually confined to a single refuge, where any persistent pressure affected all individuals simultaneously. Another parallel involves specialization of diet. Organisms adapted to one primary food source thrive while that resource remains stable. Yet if availability fluctuates rapidly, they cannot diversify intake quickly enough. Generalists shift gradually. Specialists experience abrupt decline. The mechanism is not weakness but dependency, the same dependency that tied the sea cow entirely to shallow kelp forests. Behavioral predictability also creates risk. In stable environments, consistent routines conserve energy and improve efficiency. But predictability allows repeated disturbance to intersect with behavior at the same points. Migration routes, breeding sites, and feeding grounds become fixed targets once external pressures operate deliberately. The sea cow's shoreline habits made every visit by humans effective because the species never altered location patterns. Finally, reproductive tempo matters. Long-lived organisms invest heavily in few offspring because historically adult survival remained high. When mortality rises rapidly, recovery requires decades. Short-lived species recover quickly because turnover is fast. The sea cow's slow reproduction turned short-term pressure into permanent decline, a pattern repeated whenever sudden losses exceed replacement rate for extended periods. None of these factors alone guarantee disappearance. They combine a narrow habitat, specialized diet, predictable behavior, and slow reproduction form a system stable only if conditions remain consistent. When change becomes frequent, the system lacks elasticity. Decline appears gradual until a threshold is crossed, after which recovery cannot occur even if pressure stops. This was the sea cow's final state. Its environment still contained food. The ocean still held space, but the number of surviving individuals fell below the level required to sustain future generations. At that moment, extinction became a delayed certainty rather than an immediate event. In the final part, we will step back completely and address the central idea behind the story, why evolution does not aim to create permanent species, and why the sea cow represents not a rare mistake, but a clear demonstration of how adaptation and disappearance are connected. The story of the sea cow often gets summarized as a tragedy caused by hunting, but its deeper meaning lies elsewhere. The species did not disappear because evolution stopped working. It disappeared because evolution kept working too well within a stable past. Natural selection continuously removes excess. Any trait that consumes energy without improving survival fades over generations. Over immense time spans, organisms become streamlined toward the conditions they repeatedly experience. They become precise solutions to recurring problems. The sea cow became a precise solution. Its body matched shallow, cold water grazing. Its metabolism matched low-energy vegetation. Its behavior matched a predator-free coastline. Its reproduction matched long adult lifespans. Nothing in that design was accidental or defective. For millions of years, it was one of the most successful possible configurations for that environment. If time had remained slow, the lineage might have persisted indefinitely. But precision narrows possibility. Every removed ability, rapid escape, flexible diet, dispersal behavior was an advantage while unused. Yet those same removals meant the species possessed no reserve capacity once conditions shifted. Evolution had optimized for certainty, not contingency. This is the boundary the sea cow represents. On one side lies adaptability, organisms able to tolerate variation because they retain unused capabilities. On the other lies optimization, organisms perfectly efficient but entirely dependent on stability. Both strategies are valid in nature. The outcome depends only on the pace of change. When change is gradual, optimization dominates. When change is rapid, adaptability dominates. The sea cow lived at the extreme end of optimization. Its disappearance shows what happens when environmental tempo crosses the tolerance of a specialized design. The lineage did not lose a competition or encounter an unbeatable predator. It encountered a rate of change faster than inherited responses could track, so its extinction was not merely an ending, it was a demonstration that survival in evolution is temporary alignment, not permanence. A species persists as long as its traits match its world. Once the match breaks, history rather than biology determines the timeline. For millions of years, the sea cow matched its world almost perfectly. For a few decades, the world moved faster than it could follow. And that difference, not weakness, not size, not intelligence, was enough. The only marine mammal whose evolution did not gradually fade, but abruptly reached the edge where perfection became impossibility. The end.